January 17, 1943. The air at this altitude cuts like glass. Breath freezes before it leaves the oxygen mask. Metal surfaces inside the bomber are cold enough to tear skin on contact. Through the plexiglass nose of a B-17 Flying Fortress, Bombardier Lieutenant James McClure can see the German coastline emerging from the morning haze like a dark promise. The engines, 4 Wright Cyclones, each producing 1,200 horsepower, create a sound that isn't merely heard but felt, a vibration that moves through bone and blood, a mechanical heartbeat that has carried them across the North Sea and into the teeth of the Reich. 64 bombers are in formation today. This is the first American bombing raid on Germany itself, the opening move in a campaign that will redefine the nature of aerial warfare. Below them, in the shipyards and U-boat pens of Wilhelmshaven, German workers are building the submarines that strangle Britain's supply lines. Above them, somewhere in the infinite blue, Luftwaffe fighters are climbing, their pilots already calculating intercept angles, their fingers resting on cannon triggers. What happens in the next 43 minutes will become legend, not because of what the B-17 destroys, but because of what it survives. The B-17 Flying Fortress entered the war as an idea that many considered impossible, a bomber that could defend itself, that needed no fighter escort, that could fly deep into enemy territory in broad daylight and return home. The concept violated every lesson learned in the skies over Europe during the previous war. Bombers were vulnerable. Bombers needed cover of night or clouds. Bombers fell from the sky when fighters found them. This was accepted wisdom, written in the smoke trails of 1,000 shot-down aircraft. But American military theorists in the late 1930s had become converts to a different faith.
They believed in precision daylight bombing, the idea that you could strike specific industrial targets with enough accuracy to cripple an enemy's war-making capacity without obliterating entire cities. The British, who had already learned the cost of sending bombers into defended airspace, thought the Americans naive. They had shifted to night bombing, trading accuracy for survival. The Americans insisted their way would work, but it required an aircraft that didn't yet exist, a bomber that could fight back. Boeing's answer emerged from a Seattle factory in 1935, a silvery giant with a wingspan of 103 feet and a name borrowed from military fortifications, the Flying Fortress. The designation was marketing as much as description, but it would prove prophetic. 50 caliber machine guns, initially 5, eventually 13 in the later models. It had 4 engines when most bombers had 2, and it was built with a philosophy that seemed extravagant to engineers schooled in efficiency: redundancy. Everything critical existed in duplicate or triplicate. If one system failed, another would compensate. If one engine died, 3 remained. The aircraft was designed not for optimal performance, but for survival. The Luftwaffe pilots who first encountered B-17s over Europe in 1942 understood immediately that they faced something unprecedented. Major Hans Eckerhart Bob, a veteran fighter ace with 98 confirmed kills, later described his first attack on a fortress formation. "We approached from behind and below, the standard attack profile. At 600 meters, we opened fire. We expected the bombers to scatter, to break formation, to become easy targets. Instead, they tightened up. The amount of defensive fire was unbelievable. It looked like flying into a wall of steel. I saw tracers from every direction. I thought, these are not bombers."
What Bob encountered was the combat box formation, an American innovation that transformed individual bombers into a unified defensive organism. 12 to 18 B-17s would fly in tight, staggered layers, each aircraft positioned so its guns covered the blind spots of its neighbors. 50 caliber guns converging on the same point in space. The streams of tracers created visible corridors of death. To penetrate it meant flying through a storm of metal, where each second of approach brought 200 rounds per second into the space your aircraft occupied. The men who flew in these formations understood that survival was mathematical. Stay tight, and the group survived. Break formation, and you died alone. Ball turret gunner Sergeant Michael Aruth, who flew 30 missions from English bases in 1943, recorded in his diary, "You could feel the other bombers around you, even when you couldn't see them. Their engines, their weight, their presence. We were separate aircraft, but a single entity. The Germans could kill one of us, maybe two, but they couldn't kill the formation. That's what they never understood. We weren't individuals anymore." But defensive firepower alone doesn't explain the B-17's legendary resilience. Aircraft that could shoot back had existed before. What made the Flying Fortress almost impossible to kill was its structural philosophy, a design approach that anticipated catastrophic damage and prepared for it. The B-17's fuselage was a semi-monocoque structure, meaning the skin itself bore structural loads, reinforced by internal frames. This wasn't revolutionary, but Boeing's execution was. The aluminum skin panels were thick, thicker than necessary for aerodynamic efficiency, and the frames were spaced close together. When cannon shells punctured the fuselage, the damage remained localized. A hole in a B-17 was just a hole.
In aircraft with lighter construction, a single hit could start a cascade of structural failure, peeling back skin panels, collapsing frames, destroying the aircraft's integrity. The Fortress absorbed damage like a heavyweight boxer, each blow leaving a mark but not a fatal wound. Don Hartnett, who flew the Regensburg mission in August 1943, one of the bloodiest days in the air war, wrote in his combat report, "Our aircraft was hit 187 times, we counted afterward. The tail gunner's compartment had 63 holes. The right wing had a section of skin torn away, large enough that you could see the internal structure, the ribs and spars, all bent but holding. Number 3 engine was dead, oil streaming back in black ribbons. Number 2 engine was running rough, cylinders damaged. We had hydraulic failures, electrical failures, the radio was destroyed, and the oxygen system in the waist was compromised. But we flew home. We flew home on 2 engines and willpower, and when we landed, the ground crew chief looked at the aircraft and wept. He said it was impossible." This was not an isolated case. The records are filled with B-17s returning from missions with damage that should have been fatal. Aircraft with entire sections of wing blown away, the gap covered by nothing but air and the strength of the main spar. Bombers with tail sections held on by control cables alone, the fuselage severed by flak, the tail gunner isolated in his compartment, but alive, still connected to the aircraft by the slender threads of metal that translated the pilot's commands. Fortresses with no sections destroyed, the bombardier station simply gone, the pilots flying by instruments and faith. The Luftwaffe studied these bombers obsessively. They recovered wrecks, examined the construction, interviewed captured crews. General Adolf Galland, commander of the Luftwaffe fighter forces, understood that the B-17 represented a philosophical challenge as much as a tactical one. German aircraft design emphasized performance, speed, climb rate, maneuverability. Weight was the enemy. Every kilogram mattered. German fighters were beautiful, efficient, deadly, but they were also fragile. A damaged Messerschmitt or Focke-Wulf often couldn't reach home. The pilot either landed behind enemy lines or jumped, hoping his parachute would open before he hit the ground. American design philosophy was different, rooted in industrial abundance and a democratic principle, bring the men home. Performance mattered, but not as much as survival. The B-17 carried armor plate around critical crew positions, not enough to stop all fire, but enough to deflect shrapnel, to turn fatal wounds into survivable ones. It carried self-sealing fuel tanks, a British invention that the Americans refined. When bullets punctured these tanks, the inner rubber lining would swell on contact with fuel, plugging the hole automatically. German aircraft still used unprotected fuel tanks in many models. A single incendiary round could turn them into flying torches. The Fortress carried fire suppression systems in the engine nacelles, CO2 bottles that could flood a burning compartment. It carried multiple backup systems for critical functions. If the main hydraulics failed, there was a manual backup. If electrical power was lost, there were hand-cranked alternatives for lowering landing gear, for operating gun turrets, for maintaining basic control. The aircraft was designed by engineers who assumed everything would go wrong simultaneously and asked, what can we do so the crew survives anyway? German pilots began to understand that killing a B-17 required either overwhelming firepower or perfect placement. Oberlieutenant Heinz Nock, another Luftwaffe ace, described the evolution of attack tactics. Initially, we attacked from behind, where the bomber had fewer guns, 50 calibers in the tail position, making rear attacks suicidal.
We tried attacks from below, where the ball turret offered limited fire, but they modified their formations so that upper turrets from other bombers covered the lower approaches. We tried head-on attacks, diving from above and ahead, closing at combined speeds of 500 miles per hour. This worked better. The closure rate was so fast that the bomber's gunners had perhaps 2 seconds to fire before we passed, but it required absolute precision. You had to hit the cockpit or the wing root, the areas where catastrophic damage was possible. The Luftwaffe developed specialized weapons for fortress killing, rockets mounted under fighter wings fired from outside machine gun range, 30mm cannons with high explosive shells that could tear apart wing spars, even aerial bombs dropped from above into the formations fused to explode at bomber altitude. Some pilots tried ramming, a desperation tactic that often killed both aircraft. The Germans threw everything they had at the combat boxes, and still the formations came, day after day, month after month, the 4-engine giants droning through hostile skies, absorbing losses that would have destroyed any other air force, and returning. The men who crewed the fortresses lived inside this strange paradox. They flew the safest, dangerous aircraft ever built. Each mission was Russian roulette, but the chamber held fewer bullets than it should. Waist gunner Sergeant Robert Johnson, who completed his tour in early 1944, tried to explain the psychological reality. You knew you could die. You watched bombers go down every mission, sudden explosions, or the slow corkscrewing descent with men jumping, parachutes blossoming like white flowers against the dark earth. But you also knew the aircraft would try to save you. It sounds insane, assigning intention to metal and rivets, but that's how it felt. The B-17 wanted you to survive. It would stay in the air when physics said it should fall.
It would bring you home on 2 engines, with half a tail, with the hydraulics shot away, and the landing gear stuck up. It would forgive your mistakes, your panic, your frozen hands on the controls. You'd land, climb out, look at the damage, and think, this isn't possible. The numbers tell part of the story. 7th Air Force alone had lost 4,754 B-17s in combat, nearly 5,000 aircraft, and more than 46,500 airmen killed, wounded, or captured. The price was immense. But against this, consider the 8th Air Force flew 291,508 bomber sorties over Europe. Assuming an average of 10 crew per bomber, that's nearly 3 million individual combat missions flown. The loss rate, while terrible in absolute terms, was lower than it should have been. German fighters and flak should have swept the skies clear of bombers. The mathematics of air defense favored the defender. But the B-17 changed the equation. In the winter of 1944, a damaged fortress named All-American became an emblem of the aircraft's impossible resilience. During a mission over Tunisia, a German fighter collided with the bomber, its right wing shearing through the B-17's fuselage directly behind the wings. The impact nearly severed the aircraft in two. The tail section remained connected only by the lower fuselage skin and the control cables. The tail gunner, isolated in the severed section, could see daylight through the gap, could watch the ground through the wound in his aircraft. Physics said the tail should tear away. Aerodynamics said the aircraft should tumble. But the pilot maintained control. The structure held by threads, and the bomber flew 90 miles back to base. The crew landed successfully. The photographs of All-American after landing show an aircraft that looks destroyed, that by all logic should be scattered across the Tunisian desert. But there it sits, on the runway, its crew alive.
The Germans expected American bombers to be like British bombers, like their own bombers, capable but vulnerable, subject to the same physical laws and tactical realities that governed aerial warfare. They expected that concentrated fighter attacks would break the formations, that losses would become unsustainable, that the Americans would abandon daylight bombing and admit the British were right. Instead, They encountered an aircraft and a doctrine that refused to behave rationally. The B-17 represented something beyond tactics or engineering. It embodied American industrial philosophy, abundance used as a weapon. The Fortress was not an efficient aircraft in the classical sense. It consumed enormous quantities of aluminum, steel, rubber, avgas. Each bomber required 11,000 man-hours to build and cost $238,000 in 1943 dollars, nearly $4 million today. Germany, strangled by resource shortages, could never have mass-produced such an aircraft. They would have considered it wasteful, the defensive armament too heavy, the structural redundancy unnecessary, the safety features an indulgence. But America had resources that seemed infinite to European eyes. Factories that could produce thousands of bombers, then thousands more. Training programs that turned out crews faster than combat consumed them. A logistics system that could deliver spare parts, ammunition, fuel, and food to English air bases in quantities that seemed impossible. The B-17 was designed in a context of abundance and reflected that context in every rivet. It was built with the assumption that there would always be more. More engines, more armor plate, more aluminum, more fuel to carry the extra weight, more industrial capacity to produce something other nations would consider extravagant. This abundance had a psychological effect that German military leadership struggled to counter. Luftwaffe pilots learned that shooting down one B-17 meant nothing. Tomorrow, there would be 2 more.
They destroyed American bombers by the dozen, by the score, and the formations kept growing larger. The Germans faced an enemy that could absorb catastrophic losses and return stronger. Every B-17 that fell was replaced by 2. Every crew lost was replaced by 3. The material and human reserves seemed bottomless. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, famously told his fighter pilots in 1943, "When I see a 4-engine bomber over Germany, it's a Lancaster. When I see 2 4-engine bombers, they're Lancasters. When I see 3, he paused, perhaps for effect, perhaps searching for words adequate to the reality. He was speaking of the flying fortresses, aircraft that represented not just a tactical challenge, but an ontological one, a manifestation of American power that couldn't be matched or exhausted. The symbolic weight of the B-17 extended beyond its combat effectiveness. For occupied Europe, the sight of bomber formations at high altitude, the contrails scribing geometric patterns across the sky, the distant thunder of engines, the knowledge that someone was striking back against Germany offered tangible hope. For German civilians, the same sight brought terror, but also a growing realization that the Reich was not invincible, that American power reached into the heart of Germany despite everything the Luftwaffe could do. The fortress became a symbol in American culture as well. In training films, in newsreels, in magazine articles, the B-17 represented technological superiority and moral clarity. The precision daylight bombing campaign, whatever its actual accuracy, offered a narrative that distinguished American warfare from the area bombing that consumed German and Japanese cities in fire. We struck military targets. We fought in daylight. We faced the enemy directly.
The reality was more complex. Weather often made precision impossible. Collateral damage was immense. The moral distinctions were thinner than propaganda suggested. But the B-17 embodied an ideal, a belief that American methods were not just effective, but right. The men who maintained the fortresses developed an almost mystical relationship with the aircraft. Ground crews worked through English winters, through rain and mud, through the exhaustion of servicing bombers that returned so damaged they seemed beyond repair. And yet they repaired them. They patched holes, replaced engines, spliced control cables, rebuilt hydraulic systems, worked through the night so the bombers could fly again at dawn. Master Sergeant Anthony Volpe, a crew chief with the 91st Bomb Group, kept a journal throughout his service. You start to see the aircraft as alive. I know how that sounds. But when you watch a fort come home with damage that should have killed it, when you work all night to fix something that's been shot to pieces, when you watch it take off the next morning carrying 10 men into hell again, you can't help it. These aren't just machines. They're veterans, same as the crews. Each fort has a personality, quirks, a history. Some are lucky, some are solid, some are survivors that should have died a dozen times. By 1945, the B-17 had been largely supplanted by the B-24 Liberator, an aircraft produced in greater numbers and with certain performance advantages. But the Fortress remained the iconic American bomber, the symbol of the daylight campaign over Europe. When people imagined the air war, they imagined the B-17, silver wings against blue sky, contrails spreading like chalk lines, the steady drone of Wright cyclones, and the knowledge that inside those aluminum tubes, men were flying into fire, and many would not return. But the aircraft itself would try, with every structural element and redundant system, to bring them home. The final accounting is in the stories.
The B-17 that returned with one engine and half a wing. The bomber that made it back despite fires in 3 engine nacelles. The Fortress that landed with the ball turret gunner still trapped inside, the mechanism destroyed, the turret fixed in a position that would crush him on landing, until the crew wedged himself under the fuselage and manually cranked the turret to safety while the pilot held the aircraft steady just above stall speed. The bomber that collided with a fighter, absorbed the wreckage of the German aircraft into its wing structure and flew home with a Messerschmitt embedded in its aluminum skin. These stories accumulated into a mythology, but the mythology rested on engineering reality. The B-17 was almost impossible to shoot down because it was designed from the first blueprint to survive being shot. Every other consideration, speed, payload, range, even combat effectiveness, was secondary to the principle that crews would return. This principle, born from American industrial capacity and democratic values, from the belief that individual lives mattered enough to spend extra weight and money protecting them, created an aircraft that changed the nature of aerial warfare. On that January morning in 1943, as Lieutenant McClure's bomber approached Wilhelmshaven, as German fighters rose to intercept, as the first flak bursts darkened the sky, no one aboard could know the aircraft would become legend. They knew only the immediate reality, the cold, the fear, the job ahead. 3 bombers would be lost that day, 61 would return, many damaged, all bearing the scars of combat. The raid would be declared a success, though later analysis showed most bombs missed their targets. But the strategic impact wasn't in the tonnage dropped on German infrastructure, it was in the message delivered by the returning bombers themselves. The message was simple and terrible. We can reach you, we can survive your defenses, and we will return tomorrow.
The B-17 Flying Fortress was almost impossible to shoot down because it was built by a nation that believed its citizens were almost impossible to replace. In the calculus of war, where lives are measured against objectives, where commanders speak casually of acceptable losses, the Fortress represented a different equation. It was expensive, inefficient by some measures, heavy with the weight of redundancy and protection, but it brought men home. Not all of them. War permits no such mercy, but more than should have survived, more than enemy planners calculated, more than the cold mathematics of combat predicted. In the end, the B-17's greatest achievement wasn't the tonnage of bombs delivered or the targets destroyed. It was that it forced an enemy fighting for survival to divert immense resources, fighters, flak guns, ammunition, fuel, to defend against an opponent that wouldn't stop coming and couldn't be easily killed. The Fortress transformed the air war into a battle of attrition that Germany couldn't win, because American industry could build bombers faster than German fighters could destroy them, and American training programs could produce crews faster than combat consumed them. The symbol was aluminum and rivets, 4 engines and 13 guns, 65,000 pounds of machinery that somehow flew, somehow fought, somehow survived. Inside that symbol were boys from Iowa and New York, Texas and California, who climbed into their stations every morning, knowing the odds, knowing what happened to aircraft that went down over Germany, and flew anyway. The B-17 gave them a chance. Not a guarantee, war offers no such comfort, but a fighting chance, engineered into every frame and spar and system. That chance, multiplied across thousands of bombers and hundreds of thousands of missions,
changed the outcome of the war. Not alone, victory required armies and navies, industry and innovation, sacrifice beyond measure. But the silver bombers at 27,000 feet, streaming contrails across hostile skies, absorbing fire and returning, became the visible embodiment of American power and resolve. The B-17 was almost impossible to shoot down because the nation that built it believed the men inside were almost impossible to sacrifice. That belief, translated into aluminum and armor, changed the world.